Well, hello BookTube. It's the beginning of March, which means I'm positively overdue to do a wrap-up of what I read in February and share with you what were my delights, what were my discoveries, any disappointments. Now, February was a solid, really solid reading month. Nothing was less than a 4-star read, and there were a few 5 stars thrown in there, so lots to share. I read 15 books, but it's a BookTube prize judging month for me. So 3 of those books I won't tell you anything about. They were all discoveries because they're all new authors for me. And come the 1st of April, when the judging for that round is finished and those going through to the quarterfinals are announced, I'll put up a video about the 6 BookTube prize books that I'm reading for the translated fiction section. Lucky me. So let's get on to the books I can talk about. Well, now, most of what I read this month were new authors for me, but 2 things weren't, and I'm going to start with the 2 that weren't. Okay, now, this is Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Elizabeth Gaskell is one of those wonderful British women novelists of the 19th century. What a glorious selection we had then. And I was completely in love with Mrs. Gaskell, she was known then, or Elizabeth Gaskell, in my early teens. And I'm just coming round to rereading some of her books now, a long time later, nearly 45 years. And last year I read North and South and Cranford, which were wonderful. Cranford in particular was a joy. And I reread this one as a buddy read with Laura of Laura on Air. And what should I say about Elizabeth Gaskell if you don't already know her? She's a Victorian author who is well worth reading. She's, perhaps not as unconventional as the Brontes, though she was good friends with Charlotte and wrote a biography of her, a slightly tidied up version of her life, I guess. She's not as intellectual as George Eliot, but she shares a kind of social and political sensibility, perhaps, with Eliot. This was her first book, and you really see it in this book, the way she is keen to try and it's like she assumes that her readers are probably predominantly middle class or southern, and she's almost trying to explain to them about the lives of the people of the industrial north of Britain at that time, which almost outweighs her characters in the first half of the book. But then in the second half of the book, things really fly, and we get a mixture of a kind of love story and a sort of mystery, murder, crime, thrillery bit, some courtroom drama. I mean, rowing boat race almost against the tide. Yeah, look, great stuff. I would recommend it. If you've never read any Mrs. Gaskell, do. I might start with North and South. I don't know, but Mary Barton is good. And thank you, Laura, for sharing it with me. The other author that I read, who's an author that I sort of already knew, although it wasn't a reread, it was a new book for me, is Robert Macfarlane, and this is Mountains of the Mind. Now, I was kind of chatting in the comments on someone's video, I can't even remember whose or what, with Robin of A Quiet Midden, who has a channel, but it's like wonderful nature videos on there, not book things, but she's a great reader. And we were talking about writers we like who write about nature and landscape and so on, and I enthused about Robert Macfarlane, and she said, oh, I was just about to read this one. This is one of the few Macfarlane books I haven't read. It was his first full-length book, and the reason I hadn't read it is because it's described as being a book about mountaineering, and I thought I probably won't find that very interesting. How wrong I was, because the thing about Macfarlane is he is one of these sort of amateur enthusiast polymaths. You know, he loves nature and he loves geology and he loves geography and he loves history and he loves literature and he loves people and he loves folklore and he loves, you know, and he puts all of that together in his books with really beautiful prose style. So it may technically be about mountaineering, but really it's about the history of our fascination with mountains. And yeah, brilliant book. So those were the two people I already knew. The rest were all new to me. Now there's two that I'm not really going to talk about because there are other videos about them. One of those is this one, Louise Glück, Wild Iris. I have wanted to read a collection by Glück for a while because she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2020. She's an American woman poet, and I finally got around to it, and I did a Poetry Thursday video reading one of those and talking a little bit about her, so that's that one. And the other that there's already a video about is the play that I read this month with Tilly, and because it's February was Black American History month, we wanted to read a Black American woman playwright, and we read Pipeline by Dominique Morisseau, and yeah, whole video about it, so I won't say any more, but it was certainly stimulating. So let's get stuck in now with a 5-star novel that I read this month, and this is a book that I've meant to read for a while. Okay, because it's Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, and she's a Palestinian author. It came out in 2017, and then it was translated by Elizabeth Jaquette and that came out in 2020. So basically, since 2020, I've been hearing about this and fancying it. And the thing that sort of tipped the balance to make me read it now was thanks to Bob the Bookerer and Sina of Beating Around the Books, who did this thing that Bob takes great pleasure in calling Fitzroy, except that I can't say that. But it was to read books by the Fitzcarraldo Press in February, and Minor Detail is published in the UK by Fitzcarraldo. Now, why was this a 5-star book? It had all the bits in it that Roses want most in a book. I'd say it was by a woman, it was in translation. It's a book with a passionate viewpoint and message, but not in a way that sort of pushes that at you in a polemic fashion. It's, you know, you draw your own conclusions from the book. It's structurally interesting. It's got 2 stories. It's kind of in 2 halves. The first is in the 1940s and the second is kind of in the present day. The first, the protagonist is male. The second half, the protagonist is female. The first half, the protagonist is Israeli. The second half, the protagonist is Palestinian. But the 2 stories absolutely interconnect because the first half is about an atrocity. Yes, an atrocity, and the second half is the Palestinian woman who's like a relatively ordinary woman, but she kind of just gets a thing about investigating or finding out more about this atrocity, and that pushes her to do things that are risky for her as a Palestinian woman, and that tells you a lot about kind of what it means to live under occupation, you know, about not being able to go certain places without having the right kind of pass or the right, you know, so structurally, let's say, interesting. But the thing that absolutely took it to another level for me was the style. Very, very distinctive, and I thought brilliant style, because it's about a very emotive subject, but it's very unemotional prose, deliberately so. And what Shibli does is she really uses the power of detail, as the title suggests, to kind of show you things and tell you things without melodrama, and yet it is unbelievably powerful. So you can tell that it's a strong recommendation from Roz. If you haven't read it and you don't mind something that is quite tough in a way, do. So it was interesting to read in the same month a book by an Israeli author, and that's Exit Wounds by Rutu Modan. Now, this is a graphic novel. I read it as a buddy read with Lindy of Lindy's Magpie Reads, because Lindy's kind of helping me kind of really get a better appreciation of comics, whether graphic novels or graphic non-fiction. The style, as you can see, is quite distinctive. It's sort of in the sort of Tintin sort of mode, I suppose, but this is very much an adult book, as in, you know, a grown-up story. I say it was interesting to read a book by an Israeli, I suppose, in the same month as Minor Detail, because Minor Detail is very powerful about sort of the meaning of occupation, I suppose. But if you are an Israeli getting on with your life, you know, in Israel, you don't, I guess you can't be constantly thinking about that or writing about that. And although the pretext for the plot of this book is a suicide bombing and a sort of unidentified body from that, apart from that, it's sort of, it may be there, but yet it's not, you know, it's very not explicit about that. And yet it's a really interesting story. It's a plot where I wanted to know what happened next. The characters are really well developed, and yeah, another plus recommendation, good book, well worth it, I would say. But the other graphic novel that I read, graphic non-fiction that I read this month, which I don't have because I had it from the library, was even better, I think, for me, and that was The Best We Could Do. Oh, I didn't say that this was translated by Nurse Stollman. It's always good to mention the translator, isn't it? But The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui is a kind of family history come memoir by a Vietnamese American. And I think that I love that even more, partly because I really liked the artwork in the book. The colouring and the line was very appealing to me, I suppose. But also because I really enjoyed, it's a story about migration, about being a refugee, about making a life in a new country. It's her coming to terms with herself, the author that is, by looking back at her family history, her grandparents and her parents. It's a book about generational trauma, I suppose, about how the impact of sort of war on previous generations affects those, the children. And yeah, I'm very pleased to have read it. When did that come out? 2017. It's quite a new book. Now, I read another book that was about the trauma of war this month, and it's another book of those books that I've been meaning to read for a little while. It felt like the whole world has read it last year, except for me, and that's At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. He came out in 2020 in France and won the Prix Goncourt. He's sort of Senegalese French. It was translated by Anna Moschovakis, and in 2021 it won the International Booker, the translation. It's set in World War I. It's very, very dark. It's very well written. There's a kind of a use of refrains in the book, a use of kind of slightly surreal, folklory elements, but in other senses, it's very, very realist. It takes place in both Senegal and then in the trenches of World War One. I feel like I don't need to talk a lot about it because it feels like the whole world, as I say, talked about that book. But I came to read it in February because I took part in a kind of a readathon-y thing, challenge, linked to the Africa Cup of Nations football tournament organised by Mark of Booktown with Elvis. It was great fun. I'd recommend looking out for it when he does one for the World Cup, which I'm sure he will. And I needed to read a book from Senegal because Senegal won the Africa Cup of Nations. So hence that's why I was reading. It gave me that extra push to read it this month, which was great. Another very dark, almost sort of hyper-real, surreal, strange book that I read this month was With My Dog Eyes by Hilda Hilst. Now, Hilst is a Brazilian author. She was very well thought of in Brazil, you know, considered one of their leading writers as a poet and as a novelist, but is not so well known beyond Brazil yet, not as well known as, say, Clarice Lispector, who, you know, I adore. And Una of Codex Cantina read a Hilst book and sort of said to me, have you read any Hilst yet, Ros? You should, because, you know, you're interested in, you know, if you're interested in Lispector, it's interesting to sort of compare what Hilst is like. And With My Dog Eyes was translated in 2014 by Adam Morris, and I ended up by reading it with Fraser Simons, which was wonderful. And actually, if you are very interested in this book, he's done he talks about it in one of his Friday reads. I'll link to it below because he says even more about it than I think I will. He really sort of analysed it, Fraser, but he does. What can I say about this book? It's a book that's about a mathematics professor and his complete mental and emotional disintegration. It's very distinctive style that is quite dense, quite demanding, I suppose. You know, uncompromising is perhaps a word I would use to describe Hilst's writing. She loves language and uses it very creatively, but almost not attractively, if that makes sense. You know, it's quite you get into a kind of a rhythm with it, but it's almost quite harsh, quite almost sort of obscene at times. She uses the language of mathematics in a way that I enjoyed and found interesting in this book. But, you know, it's one of those books where I'd say I recommend it, but not for the faint-hearted. I think, you know, you'll know, having heard me describe that, if that's a book that you would want to read. And some of you will rightly think, heaven forbid. Now, let's go to another positive delight of the month of February for me. And the reason this is a delight is not so much the book, although it is a very good book and an interesting book. The delight about this is The Membranes by Ta Wei. It was written in 1995, but it was translated by Ari Larissa Heinrich in 2021. And this was the February-March choice for Jen the Librarian's LGBTQ plus books in translation kind of book group, I suppose you'd call it, or you know, group ready thing. She's basically given us a choice of 2 books every couple of months and to read, and there's a Discord group. In fact, I think for April, May, Greg of Supposedly Fun is taking on sort of setting up the choice of 2 books, and they're going to maybe alternate. So what was the delight about reading this was the discussion on Discord, the Discord group. It's been absolutely fascinating. It's actually not too late to join in because this is the book for February and March, and people are still reading it and still talking about it. So I've already finished it, but you know, it's still rolling on. Or you could join for choosing the next book for April and May. The book itself is not my usual bag, I suppose, which is good because that's kind of why I take part in things like that, I suppose, because it's dystopian fiction, science fiction. It was originally written in Chinese. The author is from Taiwan. They're gay, and we had an interesting sort of discussion, I suppose, about to what extent this is a queer novel. If I say too much about it, I will actually give things away. It's one of those books where you get to the end of the book and you find something out that then means you have to slightly rethink everything you read up to that point. So I'm avoiding spoilers, but I would really say, yeah, do join in. A book every 2 months is very doable, isn't it? And it will get you reading more sort of LGBTQ works in translation. And what could be better than that? So I'm going to talk next about the closest thing I had to a disappointment this month. Now, it's really important to say that this was still absolutely a 4-star read and a book that I would recommend. But I thought it was going to be a 5-star and like maybe, you know, one of my absolute books of the month. Okay. And it wasn't. So what's the book? It's Open Water by Caleb Azumah Nelson. It came out in 2021. It's a British, Black British author from a part of, he actually comes from a part of Southeast London that I know well. I lived there for a bit. The book is also set there. So there was lots about it that kind of would make me anticipate enjoying the book a lot. And I heard really good things about it. And it is a good book. So let's talk about why it's good, and then the bit that just took the edge off it for me, I think. Okay, so he's a photographer as well as a writer. His style I liked a lot. It's in the second person, you know, so it's you know, which some people I think dislike, but that worked for me. He uses certain little like repeated phrases in the text. That again really worked for me. Some of those phrases particularly are about making you think about what it means to be looked at and not seen, and how that's, you know, the experience of being, you know, Black in London today. Well, you know, probably anywhere in England, but you know, and it's really strong on how even as a sort of successful middle class Black man, you will experience a lot of racial profiling, particularly from the police. You know, he's repeatedly in the book, you know, told that he's he fits the description of someone that we're looking for, you know, and it like, you know, description as in someone under 30, male and Black, you know, it's like, you know, of course we know all that, don't we? But this really brilliant, brings it home in a good way. It's there's a lot of reference to music and art and other writers in the book. Now, again, you could see that as a weakness. I didn't really, because I thought what he's doing is expressing things that make him feel seen rather than looked at, and that is one of the really important kind of concepts in the book. So that was okay. What took the edge off the book for me, I think, is that there's not a lot. No, it's not a problem for me that there's not a lot of plot. The problem for me was that the plot, such as it is like about a young couple or two young people. It's like boy meets girl, and then, you know, are they going to be mates, or are they going to be lovers, or are they going to be real kind of like, you know, serious relationship? And it sort of goes up and down, and they mess it up, and they don't talk to each other properly, and they kind of, you know, and I just found myself sitting there thinking, oh, for God's sake, just have sex and get on with it and start talking to each other properly, you know. And that's just me being, I don't know, that's not the story that I'm that interested in. And it because it's a first novel, and I think there's an element of autofiction about it. There was something about that I thought, oh, get over it, you know. But I'm very interested to read what he writes next. So, how did I ended the month with a very, very jolly book, which not great fiction, but goodness me, when you think of all the rather dark things I'd read, it seemed good to read something a bit more cheerful. And so what I read was a book that had just come out, you know, literally came out in February, I think, 2020, this month, you know, 2022, and it's The Twyford Code by Janice Hallett. And it was like a kind of getting in early for March Mystery Madness, because it is a mystery novel, but not a murder. It's almost like a treasure hunt. It has a kind of clever gimmick, I suppose, for its format, in that it's supposedly recordings made on an old phone that have then been transcribed with a voice to text transcription software program. So it's not a perfect I was going to say transcription, words come out slightly wrong sometimes. But as you can gather from the name Twyford Code, you realise that it's all a bit more complicated than that. There's it basically it suggests that there's a kind of a children's author from the sort of mid 20th century who's kind of modelled on Enid Blyton, and that in her books she was writing them with like a code to find some lost gold bullion. It's loads of fun and a lovely enjoyable way to end my month. So that was my February. As I say, my sort of top reads of the month, I would say, were Minor Detail and At Night with Blood is Black, and possibly The Best We Could Do, the Thi Bui graphic memoir. But everything I read was and the Robert Macfarlane, that was like a 5-star read too. But everything I read this month was definitely well worth reading, and something I would recommend to any of you. What were your top books of February, and should I read them? And roll on March and all its readathons.